So what is the deal with sanctions? The Maduro government brings up sanctions all the time. The US government threatens to impose more sanctions. Low-life self-proclaimed Juan Guaido calls for more sanctions. Even Venezuelanalysis is doing infographics about sanctions. What is all the fuss about? Here's the ultimate guide on sanctions against Venezuela. 1. What are sanctions? The US cycled through plenty of options to try and oust the Bolivarian Revolution before settling on a weapon of choice: economic sanctions, or unilateral coercive measures, if we want to be more accurate. How do they work? The US Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, simply emits orders to blacklist given individuals or companies. Any assets owned by these actors under US jurisdiction are blocked, while US persons and enterprises are banned from dealing with targeted entities. These are known as primary sanctions. Let's look at some examples. In January of 2019, Washington sanctioned Venezuela state oil company PDVSA, effectively imposing an oil embargo. Overnight, Caracas was blocked from shipping crude to the US, which meant losing some $11 billion a year in revenues in one fell swoop. Venezuela also lost Citgo, the $8 billion worth subsidiary, which was seized and later placed under Guaido's control. Months later, the Trump administration blacklisted 13 companies and 10 individuals for their alleged involvement in an intricate network to import food for Venezuela's subsidized CLAP program. When we say that sanctions mean to starve the Venezuelan people, it's not a metaphor. 2. An ever tighter blockade. An August 2019 executive order imposed a Cuba-style embargo, targeting all Venezuelan state entities. But more importantly, it paved the way for so-called secondary sanctions, giving the US Treasury Department a self-proclaimed authority to even go after non-US third parties. Starting in early 2020, the US Treasury Department began targeting foreign companies for the crime of trading with the Venezuelan state. The final clampdown came later that year, as the Trump administration started threatening enterprises that engaged in swap deals, for example, exchanging crude for fuel or food. All in all, there have been dozens of such measures, targeting everything from the Venezuelan central bank to ship captains. The cruelty and absurdity of the US economic aggression was embarrassingly exposed when a restaurant in Italy was sanctioned because its owner had the same name as someone allegedly involved in the Venezuelan oil trade. 3. Overcompliance. While on the surface sanctions are punitive measures penalizing given companies or individuals, their goals are much broader. The purpose is to make Venezuela and its state entities toxic for business. For instance, after the 2019 oil embargo, Venezuela looked to India as a prime trade partner. It made sense for both sides and could have allowed the Caribbean nation to exchange crude for medicines or fuel. But Washington was quick to warn Indian companies that there would be consequences, and large-scale firms are not willing to put their global operations in jeopardy for dealing with Venezuela. In most cases, these threats don't even need to be made explicit. As a result, Caracas is left isolated, or sees the cost of doing business grow and grow. US spokespeople always read a script that says that there are humanitarian exemptions to allow for operations like food or medicine imports. However, even anti-government NGOs admit that these are as good as nothing because of a phenomenon called overcompliance. Simply put, actors are not willing to get anywhere near Venezuela-related activities for fear of trouble down the road. The typical situation has been financial institutions refusing to work as intermediaries. In one infamous recent case, a Swiss bank blocked payments to the United Nations COVAX program, which meant months of delays before COVID-19 vaccines could arrive. 4. The impact of sanctions. The consequences of the US blockade have been nothing short of devastating. Beyond depriving the country of foreign income, stripping it of foreign assets, forcing it to default on debts, it's the impact on the Venezuelan people that should be stressed. Declined or blocked imports have forced people to face either scarce or overpriced food and medicine. Hundreds of thousands of chronic patients have no treatment. Previously eradicated diseases made a comeback due to missing or delayed vaccination programs. Fuel shortages have paralyzed transport and electricity generation, but most importantly, imperil agriculture, from tractors that cannot run to crops that cannot be transported. And a deteriorated infrastructure has brought water, electricity, and cooking gas shortages, meaning there is virtually no aspect of Venezuelan day-to-day life unaffected by the sanctions. There are all too many stories of hospitals missing equipment, people who die because ambulances have no fuel, not to mention a huge wave of migration that has destroyed families and deprived the country of qualified personnel. Venezuela was already facing a crisis, but US-led sanctions were akin to dropping firebombs on the Venezuelan economy and blocking the exits. Conservative estimates state that over 100,000 people have died as a consequence of sanctions by the US and allies. Over 30% of the population is reportedly undernourished. When people say that sanctions kill, it's not an exaggeration. 5. The corporate media coverage. Given the unilateral and illegal nature of the sanctions, and especially their terrible effects, it would be fair to expect universal condemnation, right? Well, not quite. The Venezuelan government, popular movements, even opposition sectors that don't take orders from Washington, have loudly condemned sanctions. Multilateral organizations and actors, from the US Human Rights Council to special rapporteurs, have detailed the measure's impact and demanded their immediate lifting. Inside US borders, solidarity organizations and progressive think tanks have worked tirelessly to hold their representatives accountable. As a result, there are now plenty of Democratic House members demanding that the Biden administration reverse its predecessor's policies. Even the freaking US Chamber of Commerce is questioning sanctions. So why is there no unanimous rejection of these murderous actions? Because of the corporate media. Stenographers with next to no inclination to speak truth to power have gone out of their way to endorse regime change against Venezuela, even if it means lying about sanctions or downplaying their implications. Using debunked arguments such as supposed electoral fraud, Western outlets will do anything to justify sanctions and pretend they have nothing to do with Venezuela's economic crisis. And worse, they will use euphemisms like, sanctions were designed to deprive Maduro of resources. And so a policy that has killed tens of thousands of Venezuelans is portrayed as depriving an ill-behaved child of their allowance. Another favorite is the Maduro says trick. While sanctions have been widely condemned and their effects exposed, even in Washington, D.C., corporate journalists will often write that Maduro blames sanctions for the economic downturn, or something similar, thus taking advantage of all the previous work demonizing him. Despite causing untold suffering, U.S. regime change efforts in Venezuela have failed, but it's clear that these measures are not going away anytime soon. After all, there are huge oil reserves at play, and more importantly, the need to punish any and all who dare to challenge U.S. hegemony. Sanctions will not be lifted because Western leaders will listen to their hearts or decide to respect international law. The end of the sanctions will come as a result of struggle and pressure. Here, in Venezuela, the people's resistance has been nothing short of heroic. The Venezuelan pueblo deserves all the solidarity in the world.